We're back. By now, you're probably hooked on our intro music. That's brought to you, as we are, by We Vibe Easy Productions. I'm Nick.
I'm Ben.
And we're happy to be back with you today. It's a beautiful day here in sunny Manchester. And Ben, why don't you start us off here with a little intro to what this episode's going to be about. It is an important one. I know we alluded to it in the last one, but this is a big one, and it's very much... It's more than hot button, even though it is considered a hot button issue right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm just going to get right into it. We are covering the subject of race and the racial divide in this country in this episode. And I want to preface this by saying, and it's a conversation that you and I both had, that Nick and I are coming into this conversation to look at the topic objectively and to have a discussion about it, and also to discuss why discourse on this topic is so frowned upon, and some of the things that contribute to that. But we want to also acknowledge that we understand that with this topic, unlike some of the other topics that we've covered so far, there's going to be some extremely firmly held beliefs and some really strong feelings on this topic. And we do want to acknowledge that we understand this is a serious topic to a lot of people, that a lot of people feel very strongly about it. And this whole process and the purpose for the show in the first place is to open up dialogue so that we can have serious conversations and meaningful conversations with other people about these things.
And Ben and I both, so we went back and forth on this just for a little background information on why we're choosing the Facebook post, as most of you know by now, that we chose. And we went back and forth on the other day, actually, about validating the opinions of others, because we know, as our closely held beliefs for Ben and I, we know that those beliefs and those opinions are so closely held that they're a part of who we are, much like some of the folks that we'll be discussing in some of these posts, and their opinions they feel very strongly about them.
Yeah.
And they identify within themselves, in a sense, right? Like that is their group. That is the sword that they are willing to fall on in terms of, what they'll fight to the very end, tooth and nail, right? And we all have those sort of beliefs, and we all have those opinions that are strongly held. Some are, everyone's are different, but I did think it was important to sort of preface that sort of dialogue that you and I had initially before we decided to kind of jump into this particular topic on this show.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't want to pretend like it isn't different. I do think some of the other topics that we've touched upon, like gun violence and like Antifa and protesting and militarization of police officers. Those are topics that there's two very clear opposing views and two very clear arguments, and there's rarely a situation where a topic like that comes up where perspective is the main issue in the argument. And in this case, when it comes to race and the divide in our country, I think it's all about perspective. It's all about experience, but there are some very objective viewpoints that I think we can touch upon to try and get the dialogue started.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I want to say, just so that you and I are clear, we're clear to the viewers, and I think you and I feel very similar to this, but I guess I'm going to preface diving into this particular post that we found on Facebook with a quote that I tend to view almost very closely held, probably the most closely held quote that I've ever come across. And it came from a book that I read by Christopher Hitchens. I'm sure the listeners are going to be sick of me referencing him at some point or another. But,
Yeah.
he talked about how every year he had to renew his press pass with the Senate. And, obviously they only allocate a certain amount to certain individuals to be able to be so up close and personal with Senate members, congressional members, House leaders, that sort of thing. And what he said was he went into the Senate and he was approached by the security guard to sign in, that sort of thing. And he had to fill out his waiver form and all the information that they make you fill out. And they had added a new box so that he could identify himself by what race he was. And he didn't fill that box out. Handed it in, security guard looked everything over, and he said, look, you got to fill in the box. And Hitchens said, well, that box is not indicative of how I identify myself racially as a race, And he said, well, just put white. And he goes, and Hitchens' response to the security guard was, white is not even a color, let alone a race.
Right.
Why would I put that in there? And he said, well, put Caucasian. And he said, well, I have no family lineage that originates in the Caucasus, so I'm not comfortable putting that. And he said, well, put in other how you identify. He goes, I identify as part of a human race, and I suggest that others follow suit. And I think that, to me, that's a powerful message, right?
Yeah.
And he was taking a stance because he's very much so a contrarian, but that message rings aloud across everywhere. And if you know his work and if you know what he's done, I mean, he a true advocate for people, right? Of not just in this country, but especially elsewhere. So I did want to preface that because it's very much my view. I think that, you and I can both agree on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do believe so, and that's not to say that I or even you, I think, don't believe in cultural diversity.
Right.
I think cultural. I think, somebody recently said to me, and one of the reasons, that when you had discussed bringing up this topic and finding, finding some social media posts to discuss this topic, somebody had recently said to me in another discussion about things like white privilege and the racial divide, he specifically asked me, well, Ben, why do we call black individuals African Americans? Why don't you answer me that? Why do we say Asian Americans? Why do we say Latin Americans? And so my eventual response was, historically, Reverend Jesse Jackson coined the phrase African American in the 60s, I believe. And so, and one thing that I do believe is that the reason that those terms are used in our American culture is because part of the American culture is preserving, is preserving individual cultures within our melting pot. And so I do want to draw that parallel between race and culture specifically. Because I think you're right. I think we all belong to the human race, and that's where this dialogue has to start. But I do believe that culture is something extremely important to preserve on both an individual and group level.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the cultural aspect is important as well, right? So just for me and for those that know me fairly well that are listening, I mean, you guys know that I've been playing soccer with a certain group of friends that I have for well over a decade. Most of these guys are from all across the world, but specifically all sorts of different countries in Africa. These guys are from, and they embrace their own cultural diversity depending on what country they come from, whether it be Somalia, whether it be Senegal, and I embrace that too. I've learned more probably just being soccer teammates with these guys and having conversations, pre and post practices, pre and post games about things. I've been fortunate enough to travel with these guys to locations that I probably would otherwise not see. And not only do I embrace it, but I'm a true advocate of that, because there's nothing in my mind that you can learn more from getting as close to cultural diversity as you possibly can. I mean, obviously travel's the best way, but I know that folks aren't always, it's not easy, right? There's kids and work and family and all these sort of things. But learning from other cultures is huge. I mean, it's massive.
And experiencing that culture through the individual, through peace and love, as cliche as that sounds, but certainly through acceptance of cultural individuals that are diverse from ourselves. And I think that's where we can segue into the social media post that I brought up to you earlier in the week, and what kind of sparked this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So you tagged me in this post, and as our viewers or listeners, I should say, as they already understand, this is what we're doing. We're scouring the every corner of the social media network, whether it be Facebook, whether it be Reddit. I mean, we're trying to stick to Facebook. Obviously, it's a little bit easier. And we came across, or Ben, actually, you came across this. It's sort of a meme, but it talks to the caption. It's an interview that Muhammad Ali is having, and it's a video. But the caption on this particular meme says, "You can't lump all white people together. They all aren't bad." And then it says, "My response." And you can touch. We've listened to the video, but just what was Ali's response to this?
There are many white people who mean right and in heart want to do right, but there are so few. If 10,000 rattlesnakes was coming down an aisle now, and I had a door here I could shut, and in that 10,000, 1,000 meant right. 1,000 rattlesnakes didn't want to bite me. I knew they were good. Should I let all these rattlesnakes come down, hoping that 1,000 get together and form a shield? Or should I just close the door and stay safe?
I think that...
You understand? The Viet Cong are not all bad, but America's still dropping bombs. In Hiroshima, Japan wasn't bad, but she still dropped the bomb. In Korea, they weren't bad, but they still dropped the bomb. So now I'm going to forget the 400 years of lynching and killing and raping and depriving my people of freedom, justice, equality, first fired, last hired, the lowest of low, last respected. And I'm going to look at 2 or 3 white people who are trying to do right and don't see the other million trying to kill me. I'm not that big of a fool.
So just with that video, we can touch upon collateral damage. That's a huge digression, right? Because he brought up Korea, he brought up Vietnam, he brought up all these things. If you haven't heard the dialogue between Sam Harris and Noam Chomsky related to collateral damage, I highly suggest, if you're listening, to take the time to listen to that dialogue. It's very important and it's very good, in my opinion. But what we will get into was sort of the comment that this video sparked.
Right, and so keep in mind that, as I said before, so this was a meme. This was a video that somebody posted, and as I said, this article from the Huffington Post that Adam pulled up for us. The interview took place in 1971, like I said, 50 years ago. So it's you have to also consider the context of the times, and part of the dialogue and part of what we're discussing here today is the fact that the same dialogue that was being used in the civil rights era is being used now to almost describe today's issues as a common or as a current civil rights era, which I don't know if I agree with, but that's the way that it's being pushed.
Absolutely. And as always, we will give you the dialogue verbatim, but we will not give you the names of the individuals because we don't have it's just not what we're about. So this comment definitely sparked an extensive debate on this thread, and I'll read it to you as it's written, from an individual who says, "As a dedicated activist and advocate for equality for my race and other minorities, I think it is dangerous, divisive, counterproductive, hypocritical to scream that we don't want to be discriminated against for our color, yet most of us do the same thing to them or the other races and think it's okay. Hate doesn't quell hate. Love, tolerance, and compassion does. We can't complain about something and then perpetuate the same hatred, discrimination, generalization of a whole race. We can't be hypocrites and then expect change. All it does is fuel the alt-right, white supremacists who already see us as the enemy. Let's rise above instead of stooping below. And for me, when I read that, I thought that this individual hit the nail on the head. For the most part, anyway, I think that this individual was definitely getting the message across that you can't pigeonhole people based on a few bad apples, right? In a bunch.
And it also sounds like she's saying you can't completely shut down the conversation about it just because you hold strongly held beliefs or that's your reality. Because the fact is, it may not be the reality for somebody else, and the only way we're going to be able to come together to discuss it is if we're getting those perspectives and those experiences from each other.
And I do want to, and I think that this individual makes a good point to say that, you know, by lumping everybody into one category as being white supremacist, white privilege, you know, these sort of things, to lump people in that category is creating more divisiveness. It's actually going in an entirely opposite direction of what the civil rights movement set out to achieve initially.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
So this sparked a ton of dialogue, right? There was a lot of hateful sort of messages to this person who made the original post.
Yeah, even towards her. And so I as we said before, we're not gonna name names because we don't have the ability to do that at the moment. But we will say that this appears to be from the perspective and from the keyboard, as you will, of an African American female individual.
Right. Absolutely. That's exactly what it appears like. There's very much an uninformed following series of comments towards her, which are very much emotionally reactive. I would say a lot of them. I mean, you can imagine, right? Like the listeners, you've all seen it. Somebody makes a point that somebody else disagrees with, and it becomes really a sort of an open book of hate dialogue towards that individual, ad hominem, if you will.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that you wanted to bring up here as related to this person's comment was postmodernism, and I'll kind of let you dive into why you feel like postmodernism needs to be kind of prefaced.
Yeah, I do. And so the definition of postmodernism, particularly when you're just looking at a general definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, Wikipedia, really any Google search you do of postmodernism is a late 20th century style and concept in the arts, architecture, and criticism that represents a departure from modernism and has at its heart a general distrust of grand theories and ideologies, as well as a problematical relationship with any notion of art. And so really, one of the things that postmodernism kind of reflects is the idea that there really is no objective truth or science behind much of anything. It's all about experience, and it's all about interpretation. And so I wanted to bring that up because I do feel that postmodernism in particular has kind of led to this whole divide in our country, and also some of the very hot button, hot topic terms like white privilege and institutional racism.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that as much as I possibly could. Adam brought up another tab here, and it's the United States population consensus. It's worldpopulationreview.com, and it's a population consensus. And at the top of this page, it gives a happiness index, right? So this is a ranking of happiness, and I'm sure most of you have heard it. And this is from, between 2012 and 2014. Just for the sake of conversation, the U.S., out of all the countries listed here, the U.S. is rated 15th, right? So in the grand scheme of things, happiness index wise, and we can get into what the data. Happiness is not necessarily how people are feeling on any given day, right? There's metrics that go behind that. But what many of the countries above the United States have in common is the fact that they are very much nationalistically prideful, right? So there is a strong pride. I mean, you look at the number one countries: Switzerland, number two, Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Canada, Finland, Netherlands, Sweden, New Zealand, Australia, Israel, Costa Rica, Austria, Mexico, all above the United States. There's
Quite
a
a few
cultural pride behind all of those companies, a nationalist. Now, I use the term nationalist with caution, right? Because there's been so many bad things. I would argue the slave trade in and of itself with the Americas was a direct response to nationalist movements across Europe. So, realistically, if you're looking at the population demographics of these countries, which is really what we're doing right now, and what we did prior to this dialogue, you clearly know. I say the name Switzerland, and you know that in terms of cultural diversity, there's not a lot.
No. Quite honestly, if you were looking, if there was a state in the United States that had the same demographics as Switzerland, it would be considered a haven for white nationalists.
Absolutely.
Just in the current social climate. If we were talking about United States media, if they saw the demographics of a state like Switzerland, that's what they would assume.
And either way, whether you're now, that I'm a massive fan of soccer, right? World football, we'll call it for its proper name.
We know.
So when I look at like the Swiss national team, for example, which is actually very good, you'll look at some of the individuals that play for the Swiss nationalist team, and they won't fit the preconceived idea of all white.
Right.
Fair enough?
Yeah.
They won't. But I bet you if you go to any one of those individuals and you ask them how they identify themselves, they are going to tell you they are Swiss.
Mm-hmm.
And they are proud of that. I think that part of the problem in Ali's dialogue, in this post that we're seeing in response to this young woman who commented, is there's a strong division here. It's almost as if folks are so reluctant in this country to have a sense of national pride, right? Because there's so many skeletons in the closet that it's hard to sort of keep folks aligned with the greater ideology of what kind of place we actually live in.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you think that is because of and I don't want to present it as fact, because it's part of what we are having a conversation about in this episode. But do you think that is because of the idea of things like white privilege and institutional racism? In other words, these people are having a harder time. They're having a harder time feeling that sense of pride in nation, because either through reality or narrative, they don't necessarily believe that the nation has their best interest in mind.
Oh,
over other demographics within the nation.
absolutely, absolutely, and I think that really for me that boils down to a model of capitalism as opposed to any really other thing else, right? I mean, you have capitalism in this country, free market capitalism, if you will, and sure, I'll be the first to. I've had this conversation with you several times. There's not a building in our nation's capital that you cannot pinpoint, whether it be the White House, the Treasury, the Treasury Department, wherever, that was not built brick by brick by forced labor. I mean, and that's huge. And I don't want to not acknowledge that those things existed. If anything, I want to if anything, I want to acknowledge that those sort of things happen.
But is that, and so I completely agree with you, because obviously they did, and it's a horrible part of our country's history, but do you think that is still a reason to believe there is white privilege or institutional racism in this country as it stands?
So for me personally, I don't believe that.
Okay.
But I completely understand how others would feel that way.
Okay. And so can we agree that there might be some type of qualification? In other words, and so my big problem with the dialogue and the discourse over this national issue, really world issue, is that when you're looking at white privilege, I think you and I can both agree that because of what has happened historically in this country, yes, there are certain communities, minority communities, that are starting in a tougher position economically, resource-wise, than certain predominantly white communities.
Well, you look at we kind of talked about this after the last show, sort of off air, but you look at the communities like Flint, Michigan, right? Adam brought up Flint, Michigan, brought up New Orleans after Katrina, especially,
Yep.
especially, what was it, the 17th Ward or 7th Ward in New Orleans? Those areas had a significant disaster, so to speak, once with a hurricane, the other with the pollution of the main water supply. And those are communities that are really been predominantly African American.
Yeah.
Right.
And that is where I think that where you can have a real conversation about white privilege, or at the very least, minorities and African Americans in particular being underprivileged in those situations. Not to say that they don't have the same opportunities in life from a legal standpoint in the grand scheme of things, but that they are born in an environment that is less conducive to their success than potentially white individuals born into a predominantly white community.
Right. And we can't there's statistical proof behind exactly what we're talking about. I mean, Adam pulled up something. It's racialequitytools.org is the source for this, and it's talking about gaps between richest and poorest. It's talking about food insecurity. It's talking about health and environmental justice. It's talking about youth incarceration, which is I know that this is something that's very important, right? Especially in these communities, is providing the youth of any community, realistically, not even these communities, but providing the youth anywhere with at least the opportunities to make a better life for themselves, or make the life that they set out to make.
Right. Because the fact is our country is based on equal opportunity, not necessarily equal outcome. Obviously, and that's where I like to draw a line, because a lot of people think that that equal outcome is the measure of where we need to be as a society. In my mind, it's equal opportunity, and so that's where. All that being said and all that being acknowledged, this is where the conversation starts. Because why is it this way? And what can we do to stop it, or change it, or at least have a dialogue conducive to improvement? Because the idea, I mean, here's the thing. The idea that all of these statistics are indicative of institutional racism. When I think of institutional racism, I think, show me one law in the books that is racist in intent in this country. And the fact is, you can't, because since the civil rights movement, we've had laws.
Really,
right? Exactly. We have laws in place to prevent that. Even if any old laws on the books are found in a state that are considered racist or bigoted or discriminatory, we do away with them by law. So that's why I say that this is where we need to have the conversation, and a lot of times that's where the conversation breaks down, because people don't want to hear that you don't believe that there's any institutional racism or white privilege. And oftentimes that completely ends the dialogue.
Right. And that's the big thing that I take away from these Facebook, and I see things that stretch far beyond, in terms of, you know, the discourse that transpired from this particular post. And I know we've all seen it, but the one thing that always falls short is a reasonable sort of tangible outcome. People are it seems as though people are very quick to emphasize what's taken place in the past, to emphasize that there's a problem, but are very, very much not aligned with what potential outcomes or what potential ways to fix the problems that many of us will and can acknowledge, right?
Yeah.
I think that that's a huge issue, and something to where it's really a war of ideologies, right? Because you and I are very much aligned on many things politically. We're very much aligned on but some things not. And one of the things I would say that we're not aligned on is, in particular, I don't believe in the electoral college system. You are and the reason I don't is because it empowers these populated communities, which tend to be more culturally diverse. It benefits those communities. And I know for you have your reasons why you don't, but that's a solution that I could get behind personally.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, I mean, that's particularly in terms of the electoral college and the form of democracy we use here in the United States. I mean, one of the reasons that I believe in an electoral college, or at least a form of an electoral college, not necessarily the form that we have now, where it isn't quite representative of the population in terms of how many representatives you have to, compared to the population on scale. But I do believe there needs to be some type of system in place like that, because of a need to prevent regional and identity politics. Like I said, conversation for a different time, but I completely get what you're saying. Ultimately, as far as here's where, and as I said, in terms of having no tangible no tangible fix or no tangible dialogue towards a resolution for what is going to change things. I think part of that has to do with the fact that the current narrative is not tangible in itself. I want to read you, and this is kind of in popular culture, in society today, particularly in the United States. This is kind of the definition of white privilege that I feel a lot of people use to kind of just basically tell white people in particular, or people, I don't want to say necessarily white people, but people not of color, that they just need to be silent. This is a definition. It's from tolerance.org, but the link can be found through the Southern Poverty Law Center. So this is basically a definition of white privilege that they have adopted. So this is how it reads: white skin privilege is not something that white people necessarily do, create, or enjoy on purpose. Unlike the more overt individual and institutional manifestations of racism described above, which, they go into racism before they give this definition, white skin privilege serves several functions. First, it provides white people with perks, in quotations, that we do not earn and that people of color do not enjoy. Second, it creates real advantages for us. White people are immune to a lot of challenges. Finally, white privilege shapes the world in which we live, the way that we navigate and interact with one another and with the world. And so some of the examples that this website gives are things like the fact that if you go to a pharmacy and buy Band-Aids, for the most part, those Band-Aids, the color of those Band-Aids is going to be for Caucasian skin. Or the fact that if you go to a hotel, the shampoo in the hotel rooms is predominantly going to be more for a white person's kind of hair. My problem with this is, isn't that more majority privilege? I mean, isn't it? And granted, it is to add to your point, it is just a manifestation of capitalism. But at the end of the day, isn't it just minority, or isn't it just majority privilege? And isn't that just part of living?
Right. Adam is highlighting right now as we're talking about this that, in fact, again, back to worldpopulationreview.com, the statistics are significantly, folks who identify themselves as white, which again is not a color,
right,
let alone a race.
Right.
I don't even like using the term, but they are the significant majority in this country, right? 233 million, 233.5 million out of about 318 million.
And a half, yeah.
It's about 318.5 million.
Yeah.
So clearly the majority. Now, just to touch on your points about Band-Aids and shampoo and that sort of thing, and I do think that it's important, and I do think that it's something to be brought up. I can't fathom, and maybe that's ignorance on my part, but when I go to a hotel, I either go to a hotel with a mindset of, I'm not going to even waste my time showering here, or if I do plan to do that, I bring my things from home. So I guess somebody could say, well, Nick, that's your privilege. You wouldn't think of something like that because you know those items are going to be there should you forget something, right? But it's something that I guess I'm completely oblivious to. I'll acknowledge that. I'm completely oblivious. I'm sure, maybe you're not. And I mean, to each his own. But I also think if you gave multiple options at the hotel, is that a significant step in the right direction? Is that the battle to fight? If you gave more, I guess, sort of diversity and pigmentation to Band-Aids, is that sort of the step to progress?
I don't necessarily think it is. Like, and maybe, and as here's the thing. I don't want to pretend like I have any idea what a person is feeling when they go to a store to buy a Band-Aid, or even if you want to use it as more of a recent example, that because everybody went crazy over the movie Black Panther, which was a great movie, by the way. I loved it. I loved it myself.
I have not seen it. Not into superheroes aren't my thing.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And so the fact is that a lot of people were really impressed and loved Black Panther because it was kind of the first movie that put a black superhero to the forefront. In other words, they weren't considered really just a sidekick or as maybe a main character, but a more minor character to, like, say, a Captain America or an Iron Man. This was the first superhero that kind of brought to the forefront African culture. There was a lot of
but I think it's a culture thing. And I'm sorry,
it's okay.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I do think it's a culture thing because it's not even the first African American superhero, at least Marvel DC wise. And I'm not even a big comic book person, but here's a name drop for you: Blade, as played by Wesley Snipes.
Yeah.
And that wasn't necessary. Blade was a superhero, but
yeah.
From the Marvel DC, I don't know which one, but Blade was a superhero. But because he didn't have that sort of like cultural tie-in, it's a disqualifier. I thought that movie was great, and I'm not big into superhero.
No, yeah. I am, and I love the Blade movies. So
right,
yeah,
exactly. Right. I hope that they don't make more Blade movies because I'm afraid they're going to ruin them.
Yeah,
but
and not use Wesley Snipes.
Obviously.
Right. Yeah.
Unless they used Morgan Freeman, I'd be okay with that. Topic for another day.
Right.
So
and I digress.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So you go back to these sort of things, right? And it's so easy. And this is what I'm talking about. It's so easy to target these sort of things: the Band-Aids, the movies, all of these sort of social hot button things that are day to day, but touching upon the real tangible ways is much more complex. It's much more complex, and it seems to me that it's more complex than what folks want to get into. I mean,
well, no. I mean, it is. It is more complex because here's the thing. Here's how the dialogue goes a lot of times, especially when you're talking about poverty and black communities, and so you can go into a conversation and say, listen, an institution, a left-leaning institution like the Brookings Institute comes out with a study and says, if you do not want to be poor in this country, if you do not want to be in poverty, you need to do three things. You need to graduate from high school, get a job, any job, doesn't need to be what you consider the job that will pay for, as I said, what you consider an exemplary, style of living. It just needs to be a job. And then third, and a big one in the African American community, get married before you have kids. And when I say, keep in mind that when I say it's a big issue in the black community, that's self-admitted. I mean, if you listen to any any African American senator, if you listen to Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, one of their biggest topics is fatherless children in the black community. And so obviously you can bring that up and you can say as an individual that you only need to do these three things to avoid poverty, but then the conversation always will kind of digress into, well, we can't do any of those things because of institutional racism and where we're starting as a community and as individuals being born into said community.
I agree, and I do think another point, and Adam brought up some median wage information, and this touches upon the Muhammad Ali dialogue as well. And he talks about Korea, he talks about Vietnam, and Asian Americans, and this is coming from BusinessInsider.com. It's as recent, it's somewhat recent, 2012, but the highest median household income by race between 1967 and 2012 are Asian Americans.
Asians are doing great in this country.
And I'm looking at that, thinking about the dialogue about, those sort of, we talked about the skeletons in the closet of this country where, you talk about Japanese internment camps, you talk about the railroad infrastructures and how they were created and that sort of thing. What is it that has helped sort of create that medium success in Asian American households? What is it, comparatively, obviously, to what you'll see in Hispanic, African American communities, that sort of thing? What is that? This isn't something that we're going to be able to cover in one show.
Right.
I think that this is definitely something that, stay tuned for sort of next week, because we're going to have some more dialogue and some more social media dialogue that will touch upon this as well.
Right. And so I do think that this is one of those topics that we're going to cover in different ways through multiple episodes, but particularly for this specific dialogue and talking about how we can potentially address privilege and racism and what to do about it in this country, it really should be a two-part episode to me.
And that's what we'll do. So what I do want to say is the Facebook page will be up.
Yep. Facebook page will be up. And so next week, I really want people to go into consider white privilege as a legitimate economic issue in our country. And I don't want people to look at it or use it as a term to, as I said, to silence anyone who is not of color. Because the fact is, everybody needs to be involved in this conversation. That's my opinion. And the fact is, if you are accusing someone of something in a general sense simply because of the color of their skin, like not understanding things like white privilege, that in itself is racism and is also ad hominem.
He always does it. He always gets it in at the very end. Like I said, we'll be back. YouTube as well. Adam's telling me that he's going to be having some of the shows here broadcasted on YouTube, so you can go back, listen to them. Please feel free to comment on the Facebook page. Tell us everything that we said that was wrong. We want to hear it. We appreciate it, if anything. So it's things we need it. We need it. We do.
We need it to be successful.
Yeah.
So we really... Everybody's got to comment.
Whether it's love mail, hate mail, send it our way. We want to see it. We want to hear your thoughts and opinions. And we'll be back to touch on this topic next week as well. Stay tuned.
Bye, guys.